History has a funny way of picking favorites. Most times, when Native Americans who defended their land against the European invaders are the topic, we only hear the stories of warriors like Crazy Horse and Geronimo. But what about the ones who fought just as fiercely and never got their due? Native American history is packed with warriors who could outthink, outrun, and embarrass their enemies. Yet, their names barely make a blip in most history lessons. These weren't just fighters. They were ghosts on the battlefield, stormbringers, and legends who refused to die even when the odds were stacked higher than a house of cards in a hurricane. From ambush masters to war chiefs who sent entire armies packing, here are 10 ruthless Native American warriors you probably never learned about, but absolutely should have. It's June 25th, 1876, as Lakota and Cheyenne warriors spot Lieutenant Colonel Custer's 7th Cavalry advancing. The sun beats down on the Little Bighorn Valley. Among them is Gaul, a 6'3" Lakota war chief with a reputation for brutal efficiency. His name? It means the one who goes in the middle. But on that day, he wasn't in the middle. He was at the front, leading the charge that would obliterate Custer's forces. Gaul wasn't just a fighter. He was a tactician. Born near the Moreau River in present-day South Dakota, he rose to prominence under Sitting Bull but carved his path. His vendetta against the U.S. Army was personal. Soldiers had killed his 2 wives and 3 children during an 1868 attack on his village. By 1876, he'd honed his rage into strategy. At Little Bighorn, he flanked Custer's men, using the terrain to trap them. Survivors later recalled Gaul's warriors as coming like ants from a hill, relentless, unstoppable. But Gaul's ruthlessness didn't end there. After the battle, he continued raiding settlements, once slaughtering an entire trading post crew for supplying arms to his enemies. Yet, unlike many leaders, he adapted. When surrender became inevitable, Gaul negotiated fiercely for his people's rights, later becoming a judge on the Standing Rock Reservation. A warrior turned diplomat. That's Gaul, the man who outlived his war. If Hollywood had designed a perfect warrior, Roman Nose would have been. Tall, muscular, and carved from sheer intimidation, this Cheyenne fighter was the boogeyman of the plains. His very name struck fear into settlers and soldiers alike. His real name, lost to history. Even his enemies called him Roman Nose, a nod to his prominent eagle-like profile. But his striking appearance was the least terrifying thing about him. Roman Nose wasn't just a warrior. He was a living legend, a force of nature that seemed almost supernatural on the battlefield. His power came from his medicine, a sacred war bonnet gifted by a spiritual leader, which he believed made him invincible. This wasn't just superstition. It was the kind of belief that made him fearless. And for a while, it worked. At the Battle of Platte Bridge in 1865, Roman Nose led just 30 warriors against 120 U.S. soldiers. Outnumbered 4-1? No problem. He relied on Cheyenne's hit-and-run tactics, using decoys to lure soldiers into ambushes. In just one day, his small force killed 29 soldiers without losing a single warrior. His greatest weapon wasn't just his lance or rifle, it was psychological warfare. Roman Nose would charge straight into enemy gunfire, trusting his enchanted bonnet to deflect bullets. Soldiers panicked. They misfired, lost formation, and ran. The legend of the bulletproof warrior spread like wildfire. But even the strongest legends have their weaknesses. Roman Nose's power depended on his strict spiritual code. His war bonnet was more than a symbol, it had rules. One of those rules?
He could never eat food that had touched metal. In September 1868, Roman Nose found himself at the Battle of Beecher Island, a brutal clash between the U.S. Army and a coalition of Cheyenne, Sioux, and Arapaho warriors. On the morning of the battle, he accidentally broke his ritual, eating food cooked in an iron pot. His warriors begged him to stay back. He refused. He knew that if he held back, his men would lose heart. Charging forward on his warhorse, he fought with his usual fury. But fate turned against him this time. A single bullet found its mark, tearing through his spine. He fell in the heat of battle, and seeing their fearless leader fall, the Cheyenne forces lost momentum. His death marked a turning point in that battle and the larger war for the plains. Captain Jack was a reluctant warrior. He wasn't a war chief, not in the traditional sense. He was a leader who wanted peace. But when denied, he became one of the most brilliant guerrilla fighters in Native American history. Born Kintpuash, he was called Captain Jack by white settlers impressed by his leadership and style. Jack led the Modoc people, a small but fierce tribe native to the Oregon-California border. Their homeland? The lush, fertile, and sacred Lost River region. But in the 1860s, the U.S. government forced them onto a reservation shared with the Klamath, a rival tribe. The conditions were unbearable, and tensions boiled over. 1872, after failed negotiations, Captain Jack led his people, just 60 warriors and their families, off the reservation and into the lava beds of Northern California. This wasn't just any terrain, but a battlefield for a ghost army. The jagged rock formations and hidden caves created the perfect stronghold. The U.S. Army, numbering over 1,000 men, was sent to capture them. What followed was a masterclass in guerrilla warfare. Jack and his warriors turned the Modoc War into a nightmare for the U.S. Army. Using hit-and-run tactics, they ambushed soldiers, killed them with deadly accuracy, and then melted back into the labyrinth of rock. One soldier, terrified by their tactics, wrote, "They'd shoot from nowhere, then vanish like smoke." The army, unprepared for the brutal landscape, suffered heavy losses and struggled to adapt.
But even warriors as cunning as Captain Jack couldn't fight forever. The Modocs were outnumbered and running out of supplies. In early 1873, the U.S. government attempted negotiations. General Edward Canby, a well-respected officer, met with Captain Jack in what was supposed to be a peace talk. But Jack's people pressured him to take a drastic step: kill Canby. They believed it was the only way to force the army to retreat. Captain Jack made his move during the tense meeting on April 11, 1873. He pulled a hidden pistol and shot General Canby point blank, the only U.S. general ever killed in the Indian Wars. It was an unprecedented act that shocked the nation and sealed Jack's fate. The army, enraged, launched an all-out assault. Hunted relentlessly, Modoc turncoats eventually betrayed Captain Jack, who had lost faith in the fight. He was captured, paraded before the press in chains, and sentenced to death. When asked for final words, he remained defiant. "I am ready to die. I will not beg." On October 3, 1873, he was hanged. But even in death, the indignities continued. His skull was stolen and displayed in a museum, a grim reminder of how native warriors were feared in life and exploited in death. At 6 feet 6 inches, Mangas Coloradas, red sleeves, wasn't just a leader, he was a force of nature. Towering over most men of his time, he was one of the largest and most intimidating figures in Native American history. Born into the Bedonkohe Apache, his name came from the red-dyed sleeves he wore as a warning. Cross me, and this fabric will be dyed with your blood. But Mangas wasn't just a warrior. He was a strategist, statesman, and the driving force behind Apache resistance that haunted Mexico and the United States for decades. By the 1830s, he had done something no Apache leader had achieved. He united multiple Apache bands, Bedonkohe, Mimbreño, and Chiricahua, into a near-invincible guerrilla force. His warriors struck settlements with surgical precision, cutting supply lines, ambushing military convoys, and vanishing into the desert before anyone could retaliate. Mangas' warpath began in 1837 after a betrayal that would shape his destiny. Mexican authorities, eager to wipe out the Apache, lured him with promises of trade and gold. But instead of diplomacy, they tied him to a tree and whipped him nearly to death. The experience didn't just leave scars, it left a vendetta. He escaped, vowing revenge, and spent the next 2 decades ensuring Mexico regretted ever crossing him. His revenge was brutal and effective. He launched relentless attacks on northern Mexican settlements, reducing villages to ashes and slaughtering those who resisted. But he wasn't reckless. He knew the power of fear. Instead of wiping out entire settlements, he often left survivors behind to spread the horror. "Let them tell others what happens to those who steal Apache land," he reportedly said. His name became a whispered warning across Mexico. The government placed a bounty on his head, dead or alive, but no one dared collect it.
Mangas turned his fury toward the new invaders as the U.S. expanded westward. He allied with Cochise, another legendary Apache leader, and together they terrorized U.S. outposts, derailing the idea that the West could ever be tamed. But in 1863, the United States tried a different tactic: deceit. Under a white flag of truce, U.S. soldiers invited Mangas to a peace conference. Trusting their word, he arrived unarmed. Instead of talking, he was arrested and thrown in chains. That night, while in captivity, soldiers brutally tortured him, heating bayonets and searing his body. Then, in a cowardly act, the guards executed him, claiming he had tried to escape. The official story ignored that Mangas was 70 years old, unarmed, and wrapped in a blanket when he was shot. But killing a legend doesn't kill his cause. His death backfired spectacularly, igniting a new wave of Apache resistance led by Cochise, Geronimo, and Victorio. If the U.S. had hoped to break Apache resistance by executing Mangas, they instead made him a martyr. Victorio was more than a warrior, a master of survival, deception, and guerrilla warfare. This Cheyenne Apache leader spent 3 years evading 2 of the most powerful armies in North America, outsmarting both the United States and Mexico at every turn. Victorio's war wasn't about conquest, it was about survival. When the U.S. Army forced his people onto a desolate reservation in New Mexico in 1877, he knew they wouldn't last. The land was barren, food was scarce, and disease ran rampant. So, instead of watching his people die, Victorio led 300 followers off the reservation and into the mountains. He made the entire U.S. military look like fools for the next 3 years. Despite being outnumbered, outgunned, and constantly pursued by over 5,000 U.S. and Mexican troops, Victorio turned the entire 10,000 square miles of the Southwest into his chessboard. His secret weapon? The international border. Victorio used the U.S.-Mexico boundary like a revolving door. He'd attack an American outpost, then slip into Mexico, daring U.S. soldiers to follow, which would have sparked a diplomatic crisis. When Mexican forces pursued him, he'd vanish back into U.S. territory. This cat-and-mouse game made him nearly impossible to catch. His tactical genius didn't stop there. He used mirror signals to coordinate attacks from miles away. He hid weapon caches and food supplies in caves only his warriors could find. They stole U.S. cavalry uniforms and used them to infiltrate enemy ranks before ambushing patrols. By the time the Battle of Tres Castillos came in 1880, Victorio had become a legend, but even the best warriors run out of luck. Mexican soldiers, backed by Apache turncoats, finally trapped him in the mountains of Chihuahua. At first, it looked like just another Victorio victory. His warriors lured the enemy into a canyon and then unleashed a deadly crossfire from above. But a Tarahumara scout betrayed his location, and Mexican forces surrounded him. Victorio knew there was no escape. Rather than be captured, he is said to have sung his death song, declaring, "I will die as I lived free." He fought to his last breath before a Mexican lancer ran him through. The U.S. Army had spent over $2 million trying to capture him, a sum that would be over $60 million today. But Victorio never feared their wealth, famously telling a soldier, "Money cannot buy the wind." His death should have ended the Apache resistance, but it didn't. His fight was carried on by warriors like Lozen, his sister and a legendary female Apache fighter, and Geronimo, who would later become the last great Apache holdout. You know that saying, "Revenge is a dish best served cold"? Well, Nana didn't believe in waiting for the dish to cool. He served it scalding hot over and over again. Now think about this. You're 75 years old. Your eyesight is failing. Arthritis gnaws at your joints. Most men your age are sitting by the fire, telling war stories. But not Nana. This Cheyenne Apache war chief spent his old age becoming the Southwest's worst nightmare. It all started with a loss. In 1861, Mexican soldiers murdered his family, his wife, children, and grandchildren. Nana didn't just grieve. He burned with a vengeance that refused to die. He allied with the legendary Victorio, launching brutal raids against Mexican and American forces. His attacks were so relentless that newspapers dubbed him the Apache Cyclone. But in 1880, Victorio was killed, and the U.S. cavalry probably thought that was the end of Nana's wrath. They were dead wrong. In 1881, this elderly warrior led one of history's most terrifying Apache campaigns. With just 40 warriors, Nana embarked on a 1,200-mile rampage across New Mexico and Texas, striking settlements, looting ranches, stealing hundreds of horses, and evading capture at every turn. The U.S. military threw 1,400 troops at him, but they never even caught a glimpse of him. One soldier wrote in frustration, "He moves like a ghost." We'd find his campfires still warm, but he was gone. How did Nana keep outrunning soldiers half his age? He was a master of the land. He hid in caves for days, waited for dust storms to strike before attacking, and used false trails to throw off trackers. His warriors could ride 100 miles in a single night, stopping when their enemies collapsed from exhaustion. And Nana wasn't just a battlefield tactician. He was ruthless. One of his favorite tricks? He'd leave stolen horses behind, booby-trapped with poisoned feed. Soldiers who took the bait would find their mounts dead, and themselves stranded in the desert. Even as he pushed 80 years old, Nana wasn't done. He joined Geronimo's final rebellion, proving age couldn't dull his rage. But in 1886, he was finally captured and shipped to a Florida prison. Even then, he never surrendered. When a guard mocked his frailty, Nana gripped his cane and growled, "I may be old, but I can still teach you how to die." And with that,
he cemented his place in history as one of the most feared warriors of the Apache resistance. You've heard of Joan of Arc, but have you heard of Lozen? She wasn't just a warrior, she was a legend.
Sister to the great Apache leader Victorio, Lozen was born to fight. But what made her different? She had a gift. While others carried rifles, she carried supernatural foresight. Powerful, talented warriors believed she could sense enemies before they arrived. Here's how it worked. Lozen would place her hands on the ground, close her eyes, and feel the earth's vibrations. Then, as if guided by spirits, she'd say exactly where the enemy was, how many, how fast, and which direction they were coming from. And she was never wrong. Victorio trusted her more than anyone. She rode at his side, planned ambushes, and led daring raids. But in 1880, tragedy struck. Victorio was killed at the Battle of Tres Castillos, and Lozen wasn't there. She had been escorting a pregnant woman across the Rio Grande, ensuring the mother and child were safe. When she returned to find her brother dead, she didn't grieve. She went to war. She joined Geronimo's resistance, using her skills to guide warriors through enemy territory undetected. One of her greatest feats? In 1885, she led 35 Apache families out of U.S. custody, evading soldiers for 10 days without food or water. How did she keep them alive? By collecting rainwater in her horse's hoofprints. But fate caught up with her. In 1886, she was captured and imprisoned in Alabama. She didn't die in battle like her brother. Instead, she died of tuberculosis in an unmarked grave thousands of miles from her homeland. But legends don't need graves. Whitebird played the long game. While Chief Joseph's surrender speech, "I will fight no more forever," made headlines, Whitebird's refusal to quit became the Nez Perce's secret anthem. During the 1877 Nez Perce War, he masterminded shadow tactics that baffled the U.S. Army. His signature move? Ambushing troops at dawn, then vanishing into thick fog. You couldn't see your own rifle. The war's climax came at the Battle of Bear Paw. After a 5-day siege, Joseph surrendered. But Whitebird? He slipped through enemy lines with 50 followers, trekked 200 miles to Canada, and lived freely under Sitting Bull's Lakota. The U.S. demanded his extradition. Canada refused. He spent his final years in Saskatchewan, still taunting American agents. "Come and get me." See, Whitebird's death remains a mystery. In 1932, he was found stabbed, possibly by a jealous husband or a U.S. spy. His grave? Unmarked. His revenge? Eternal. In 2019, Nez Perce leaders repatriated his remains from a Canadian museum. Talk about a final escape. Born in 1822 near the Platte River in present-day Nebraska, Red Cloud became a chief of the Oglala Lakota Sioux. Conflicts with rival tribes and encroaching settlers marked his early years. These experiences honed his leadership and combat skills. By the 1860s, Red Cloud had become a central figure in his people's resistance against U.S. expansion into the northern plains.
The discovery of gold in Montana led to an influx of miners traveling through the Bozeman Trail, which cut through the heart of Lakota hunting grounds. Determined to protect his people's territory, Red Cloud orchestrated strategic attacks against U.S. military forts along the trail. This period, known as Red Cloud's War in 1866 to 1868, showcased his tactical prowess and unwavering commitment to his people's sovereignty. One of the most notable events during this conflict was the Fetterman Fight on December 21, 1866. Red Cloud's warriors lured a detachment of 81 U.S. soldiers, led by Captain William J. Fetterman, into an ambush near Fort Phil Kearny. The entire unit was annihilated, marking one of the U.S. Army's worst defeats in the Indian Wars. This victory underscored Red Cloud's effectiveness as a military strategist. The sustained resistance led by Red Cloud compelled the U.S. government to reconsider its approach. In 1868, the Fort Laramie Treaty was signed, resulting in the abandonment of U.S. forts along the Bozeman Trail and the recognition of the Black Hills as part of the Great Sioux Reservation. This treaty marked a rare instance where the U.S. conceded to Native American demands. Despite this diplomatic victory, the discovery of gold in the Black Hills in the mid-1870s reignited tensions. Red Cloud traveled to Washington, D.C. to advocate for his people's rights, but faced increasing pressure from the U.S. government. In his later years, he continued to serve as a spokesperson for his people, striving to navigate the challenges posed by encroaching settlers and changing policies. Red Cloud passed away on December 10, 1909, at the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota.
Born Makataimishi-Kiakiak around 1767 in the village of Sokanook, located in present-day Illinois, Blackhawk rose to prominence as a war leader of the Sauk tribe. At an early age, he distinguished himself in battle, leading successful raids against rival tribes and later against encroaching American settlers. His leadership was characterized by a steadfast commitment to defending his people's homeland along the Rock River.
In 1804, a controversial treaty ceding Sauk and Fox lands east of the Mississippi River to the United States was signed.
Blackhawk and many of his people rejected the legitimacy of this treaty, as a minority faction signed it without broader tribal consent. Tensions simmered for years, resulting in Blackhawk's decision to lead his band across the Mississippi in 1832, seeking to reclaim their ancestral lands. This movement sparked the Black Hawk War of 1832. Despite initial attempts to avoid conflict ensued between Black Hawk's band and U.S. militia forces. One notable encounter was the Battle of Stillman's Run on May 14, 1832, where Black Hawk's warriors repelled a larger militia force, showcasing Black Hawk's tactical skill and the determination of his warriors. This early victory, however, was short-lived as U.S. forces quickly regrouped, bringing in reinforcements that included militia volunteers and regular Army units under General Henry Atkinson. As the war progressed, Blackhawk and his followers faced relentless pursuit. The U.S. forces, outnumbering and outgunning the Sauk warriors, capitalized on superior firepower and logistics. Blackhawk's band, which included women, children, and the elderly, was forced into a desperate retreat through hostile territory. Starvation, exhaustion, and skirmishes took a devastating toll on his people. The conflict reached its tragic climax at the Battle of Bad Axe in August 1832 near the Mississippi River in present-day Wisconsin. Attempting to cross the river and escape into Iowa, Blackhawk's band was intercepted by U.S. forces and militia. The ensuing massacre left hundreds of Sauk and Fox dead, many of them non-combatants. The survivors were either captured or scattered, marking a grim end to Blackhawk's resistance. Following the defeat, Blackhawk surrendered to U.S. forces. He was imprisoned briefly and then transferred to Fort Monroe in Virginia, where he met with President Andrew Jackson. Despite his status as a prisoner, Blackhawk was treated with a mix of respect and curiosity. His dignified demeanor and eloquent speeches captivated many.
In 1833, Blackhawk was released and allowed to return to his people, who had been relocated to Iowa. He lived in relative obscurity for the remainder of his life, but remained a respected elder and storyteller. In 1833, he dictated his autobiography, Life of Blackhawk. the first Native American autobiography published in the United States. The book offered a rare glimpse into the struggles of Indigenous people during a time of immense upheaval. Blackhawk died on October 3, 1838, in what is now Davis County, Iowa. His legacy as a fierce protector of his people and their land lives showcases the resilience and courage of Native American tribes in the face of overwhelming odds. And with that, we wrap up today's video. Which story surprised you the most? Let us know in the comments. We hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you for joining us once again. Remember to hit the subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you will be the first to see our new updates. See you in our next video.